Megan awoke in the middle of the night to the familiar silence of her home. She lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, where life came to a standstill after sundown. Working as a freelance editor, she rarely left the house, enjoying the solitude and tranquility. The house was her sanctuary, a place where she could disconnect from the world and immerse herself in her work. A couple of times a week she went out into the city to do some shopping or meet friends in cafes, but most of the time she was surrounded by silence. That evening there was nothing to worry about. Megan finished the last edits for the client, watched a couple of episodes of her favorite show, and went to bed. The night was cold but windless. Her bedroom windows overlooked the forest that stretched behind the house. Sometimes she could hear the wind howling in the night, but tonight the forest was silent, and it was strangely comforting. There wasn't a soul around, the neighbors lived too far away, and no one disturbed her peace. The house wrapped her cozily in warmth, and Megan fell into a sound sleep. But close to midnight, something changed. Through her half-sleep, she felt the air in the room grow heavier. As she listened, she heard a faint, barely perceptible sound, like something rustling quietly downstairs. Megan pushed the unpleasant sensation away, convincing herself that it could have been the wind or a random noise, and decided not to pay it any mind. She was brought back to reality by a second, more distinct sound coming from the kitchen. Megan crouched on the bed, trying to focus. The strange scraping sound, like someone trying to open a door, came again. Her heart sped up. She knew every corner of her house and every sound it made, and this was something new, something foreign. Megan held her breath and listened. Could it be her imagination playing out? Maybe her subconscious was looking for a threat in an empty house when in reality everything was quiet. She carefully climbed down from the bed, threw on her robe, and headed for the door. The floorboards creaked quietly under her feet, increasing her tension. It was dark in the hallway, only the dim light of the moon coming through the window creating bizarre shadows on the walls. She didn't turn on the lights, fearing that the bright light might draw someone's attention from outside. As she approached the kitchen, the noise stopped. Silence seemed to take over her house again, but the tension wouldn't let go. Maybe it's just a rat, she thought, eager to reassure herself. After all, the house was old, and small animals sometimes crept through gaps in the walls. Megan stood on the threshold of the kitchen, her heart still beating faster than usual. She was just about to decide to go back to bed when there was a knock on the door. The muffled but steady knock made her freeze in place. Who could come at a time like this? Another knock, stronger this time. Her heart sank. Megan walked slowly to the door, trying not to give away her presence. Through the peephole, she saw a man standing on the porch. It was her neighbor, Jackson. He lived nearby in an old house across the street, and sometimes helped her with household chores, like fixing a faucet or a fence. He didn't look threatening, but for some reason she felt uneasy. "Megan, open up," Jackson said in a low but insistent voice. "There's someone walking near us. I heard footsteps behind the house. Are you all right?" She froze, feeling panic growing inside. Of course, he could have just been worried about her, but somehow his words only heightened her fear. Something in his tone sounded strange, different than usual. She wanted to trust him, but something kept her from opening the door. "Jackson," I didn't hear anything she said with difficulty. "It's okay." "Megan, you don't understand." His voice became more insistent. "It's dangerous in here. Open the door. I'm not leaving you alone." There was still silence outside, but now the silence seemed ominous. Megan still stood at the door, unsure of what to do. On the one hand, Jackson looked concerned, but his insistence was beginning to frighten her. He kept knocking, insisting that she needed to let him inside. What if he was telling the truth? What if danger really is near? But suddenly something flashed through her mind. Why was Jackson knocking on the door instead of ringing? She was sure he had her number. Why hadn't he called and warned her in advance? "Jackson, you could have called," she said through the door, trying to remain calm. "My phone's dead," he answered quickly. "Come on, open up." but she knew something was wrong. Jackson had never come to her house this late. At that moment, she was gripped with real fear. She realized something wasn't adding up. The silence outside was deafening. Megan stepped away from the door when she heard Jackson mutter something irritably under his breath. He began nervously pounding harder, then fell silent. Megan stood in the shadows, unmoving, listening to the footsteps moving away from the door. The danger seemed to have passed, but suddenly there was a scrambling sound near the kitchen window. Someone was there, behind the curtain. Megan froze. Suddenly the curtain twitched, and for a moment she saw a face, a strange, scary face. She almost shrieked, but clamped her hand over her mouth. It wasn't Jackson. In that moment, Megan realized Jackson wasn't trying to save her at all. He was part of something far more horrible. Fear paralyzed her. She rushed into the bedroom, locking the door with the key. Her heart thundered inside, tearing her apart. Time stretched endlessly as she sat shivering in the darkness, listening to the sounds outside the door. Several minutes passed, but nothing was happening behind the door. Megan had almost decided it was all a nightmare when the knocking sounded again. This time it was quiet, almost imperceptible, but now she knew there was a real threat lurking behind it. Her phone flashed and she saw the message. "I'm here for you." It was Jackson's number, just not his text. The house on the outskirts looked perfect. The friends stood in front of Josh's new home, enjoying the view of the spacious one-story house with panoramic windows. The quiet suburbs surrounded it on all sides, and the forest stretching behind it created an atmosphere of privacy and tranquility. Josh was finally able to afford his own place, and this evening was special as his friends came over to celebrate the housewarming party. Meg, Andy, and Jake arrived after work, bringing gifts and drinks. The sun was already starting to set, casting a soft orange light on the house. It was cozy, with snacks on the living room table, background music playing softly, and the fire in the fireplace crackling, giving the illusion of warmth and security. Josh smiled as he looked around the house. It was exactly what he had dreamed of: spacious rooms, an open floor plan, and most importantly, no neighbors behind the wall. They could make noise, play board games, and discuss the latest news. No one would complain. "We finally got this group together," Andy said, putting his arm around Meg's shoulders. "It's been a long time since we've been together like this." "Gosh, Josh, this place is gorgeous now," Jake said admiringly, setting the bottle of wine on the table. "Just don't forget to invite us over more often." Time passed. Jokes, memories, and laughter filled the room, and no one seemed to mind that the shadows outside the window were slowly fading and night was falling. The house seemed to cut them off from the outside world, providing protection and peace. Close to midnight, a quiet knocking sounded outside the window. Josh, who sat closest to the window, flinched, but didn't immediately recognize it. The knocking was repeated, but it was more insistent. At first they thought it was the wind, but Josh came closer and saw a figure standing on the porch in the darkness. "Someone's at the door," he said, frowning. The others looked at each other in surprise. "At this hour?" Meg asked, perplexed. "Did you call for someone else?" "No, no one," Josh answered, walking to the door. The knocking intensified. Josh opened the door and a stranger stood on the doorstep, a young man with a worried look and disheveled clothes. He was clearly frightened and looked like he had been wandering through the woods for hours. "Help." The stranger exhaled, breathing heavily. "I need to hide. He's following me." The friends froze. The fear in his eyes was real. Josh quickly looked back at his friends, and they, also at a loss, nodded. Josh let the man in, and the door slammed shut with a thud that seemed to cut them off from the outside world. The stranger's name was Tom. He looked absolutely exhausted and nervous, like a man on the verge of a panic attack. Meg brought him a glass of water, and Andy cautiously asked what was going on. "There's a man following me," Tom began, shaking with fear. "I don't know who he is, but he's following me. I've tried to get away, but he always finds me. I've seen him watching your house, standing in the woods." Those words made everyone tense up. Meg slowly looked out the window, beyond which was impenetrable darkness. The forest looked very different now that night had fully fallen. Josh walked over to the window, but saw nothing. Maybe it was just paranoia, Jake suggested, but there was a hint of doubt in his voice. "No," Tom sharply exclaimed, jumping up from the couch. "He's there. I saw him. You must feel as if someone were watching you, right out of the darkness. He's always there, always watching." Everyone in the room began to feel strangely uneasy. The feeling that someone might be watching them from outside permeated the air. No one dared to look out the window again for fear of what they might see there. The silence in the house became too loud. Every rustle and creak seemed to intensify. Suddenly there was a loud bang on the door and everyone flinched. Was that the stalker? Josh rushed to the door, but when he looked through the peephole he saw no one. "I don't see anything," he said, his voice shaking. Tom shook harder. "He's always playing games with you. First he makes you think you're alone. Then he shows up out of the blue when you're already sure you're safe." Tom's words hung in the air, causing an oppressive sense of panic in everyone. No one knew what to do next. The sense of danger grew with every passing second. A new series of knocks sounded at the back door. Now it wasn't a knock, but a sharp, fierce rumble, as if someone was trying to kick the door in with a force that an ordinary person would be unlikely to exert. Josh, grabbing a kitchen knife, tried to make his way to the backyard, but fear gripped him so tightly that his legs barely moved. "We should call the police," Meg suggested panickedly, shaking with fear. Andy tried to reach for his phone, but the screen wouldn't light up. The phone was completely dead, although he remembered exactly that his battery had been half full when they arrived. Jake rushed to the outlet to plug in the charger, but the power suddenly went out. The house plunged into total darkness. "Damn it," Jake shrieked, his voice shaking with fear. "What's happening?" In the darkness, the friends heard only each other's heavy breathing. Every second seemed like an eternity. Suddenly there were footsteps, slow and sure, from inside the house. Someone was with them. "It's him," whispered Tom, huddled in a corner. In the utter silence there was a sudden scrambling sound, and a figure entered the room. It was tall, its movements slow, almost unnatural. All four froze with horror, unable to utter a word. Meg took a step back, her heart pounding frantically as the creature came closer. Tom began to sob loudly, squeezing himself even tighter. Andy grabbed the nearest vase, intending to protect himself. The lights flared up again and the house flooded the room, and for a moment everyone froze, stunned by what was happening. For a split second it seemed to them that it had all been a figment of their imagination, that the fears and feelings of persecution had been fleeting. But as soon as Thomas opened his mouth, everything collapsed. "He's here," Thomas whispered, his voice shaking with fear. "He found me." Everyone looked at the door, pressing the lock. The door was closed, but the feeling of menace never left them. Thomas began to panic, jumping up from the couch and frantically looking around. "Calm down," Tom, Andy said gently, stepping closer to him. "We're safe here. No one's coming in." But Thomas shook his head, his face white with terror. "You don't understand. This man, he's not just a killer. He's playing with his victims. He's always around, even when it seems like he's not. He was outside, watching us. He's already here." Doubt flashed across Josh's face, but Tom's panic was so genuine that he began to hesitate. Meg asked quietly, "Didn't you say no one's ever tried to come in before?" "No, but he makes you afraid. Makes you lose your mind. Yeah, I've run away from him a few times, but every time he comes back, he kills slowly. Starts with your mind." Jake, trying to calm everyone down, said, "Look, this is just nonsense. There's no way anyone could be watching us out here in the middle of nowhere. You're being paranoid, Tom." And that's when the knock came again, loud, insistent. All four of us froze. The knocking intensified, turning into aggressive pounding on the door. Josh rushed to the door, glancing through the peephole, but no one was there. "No one," he said, his voice trembling. "You're lying," Tom exclaimed, his eyes darting around. "He's always hiding, always. You just didn't see it in time." The knocking stopped, but the tension in the room peaked. An impenetrable silence froze over the friends, giving them no chance to relax. Suddenly they heard a new sound, quiet footsteps walking along the side of the house. By the time they realized the footsteps were coming from behind the window, the lights in the house had gone out again. Meg cried out in fear, her voice caught in her throat. "We have to get out of here," she shouted in panic, trying to find some way out. But Tom said in a frozen voice, "It's no use. Once he decides you're his target, you can't escape anymore." Footsteps froze outside the window, and someone began to slowly scrape the glass. An icy fear ran down the backs of everyone in the room. Josh grabbed a knife off the kitchen table in desperation, raising it in a defensive posture even though he himself was barely on his feet. "We have to go out the back way," Andy whispered, clenching his fists, trying to suppress his panic. "If we run out into the woods, maybe we'll have a chance to escape." Everyone nodded, preparing to make a dash for it, but as they neared the back door, its handle began to turn slowly. "No," Jake shouted, rushing to the door to hold it shut. The knob jerked, but didn't turn all the way. The tension was building. The house was in chaos. Meg began to cry, her hands were shaking, and Tom looked more distraught by the moment. "He won't leave us alone," he repeated like a mantra, lurking in the corner. Suddenly the door burst open with a crack, and a man appeared on the threshold. An ordinary-looking man with an unassuming face, dressed in a black jacket. In his hands was a long knife. "Are you scared?" he smirked, looking at everyone. Josh, clutching his knife, gathered his courage and stepped forward. "Get out of here. We called the police." "The police?" The man mockingly interjected, his voice full of venomous sarcasm. "You think that's going to make a difference?" Meg slumped against the wall, her heart pounding like crazy. Tom had fallen completely into a daze, as if resigned to his fate. "We can work this out peacefully," Jake suggested, trying to look confident. "Just leave." The man stepped slowly into the room, his smile turning into a cold grimace. "I'm not here to leave." He took a step forward, and fear gripped everyone. Andy, driven by adrenaline, lunged at him, trying to knock him down, but he pushed him aside with unexpected force. Josh swung his knife at his attacker, but he dodged quickly, grabbing his arm and twisting the knife so that Josh fell to his knees, crying out in pain. "I told you," Tom began in a low, muffled voice, his gaze fading. "He won't leave us." Then the man turned sharply toward Tom and smiled. "You were right, Tom. You've always been right." With those words, he took one last step forward and panic began to set in the room. Meg tried to run out, but didn't have time as the man rushed forward again. The final part. Blood froze on the floor, chaos engulfed the room. Josh, lying on the floor with his arm twisted, was still clutching the knife, but the pain prevented him from getting up. Meg tried to run out of the house with a desperate cry, but the man quickly intercepted her, pushing her into the wall. She slid down, gasping in fear and pain. Jake, gathering his strength, grabbed a chair and swung, aiming for his attacker, but he was faster. The maniac dodged and stabbed Jake in the side. Jake shrieked and fell, clutching at the wound, blood soaking his shirt. "No," Andy shouted, lunging at the maniac with his fists, but it was no use. The man easily repulsed his attack, knocking Andy to the floor, where he remained motionless, stunned by a hard blow to the head. Meg tried to get up, her hands shaking, but there was desperation in her eyes. She knew they had little chance. Tom sat in the corner, completely immersed in his madness, muttering something to himself. His words were incoherent, as if he had already resigned himself to what was next. "Why are you doing this?" Meg whispered, trying to keep her consciousness. "Why are you killing?" The man paused for a moment, looking at her with a faint smile. "I don't kill for fun," he answered calmly, his voice as cold as ice. "It's just part of the game. They run, they scream, they cry. But at the end it's always the same silence. It's the most beautiful thing. The moment when everything stops. When no one fights anymore. That's when the real peace comes." It's him," she whispered. "Who is he?" The neighbor looked at them in surprise, but Josh didn't let Meg finish her sentence, slamming the door shut. "That's impossible." He was here, she whispered, gasping, looking at the maniac's body on the floor. But something wasn't right. When they looked at the dead killer again, their faces turned white. The body lay the same, but something was different. A mocking sneer still gleamed in his eyes. Josh realized with horror that this wasn't over. The neighbor wasn't what he seemed, and the maniac probably knew it all along. Josh froze in front of the door, his breathing quickening. There was something odd about the man next door. His face seemed familiar, but there was also something sinister about it. As Josh slammed the door shut, his hands shaking, he looked back at the others. "It's impossible," Meg whispered, clinging to Josh. "I saw him. We all saw. How could he be here?" "He was outside, but how?" "Then how is the body lying here?" Jake's voice was weak. He was still holding onto his wound, blood slowly running down the side of his shirt. The friends' hearts were pounding in unison with the desperate pounding on the door. Suddenly Tom, who had been sitting in the corner all this time, raised his head restlessly. His eyes, blank and clouded until that moment, suddenly gleamed with madness. "They always come back," he said in a whisper, his voice trembling with excitement. "It's not just one person. They are everywhere. It's part of the game." "What are you talking about, Tom?" Josh looked at him with irritation, but the feeling of unease wouldn't let go. Meg walked slowly to the window and peered cautiously through the curtains. There, in the darkness, in front of the house stood a man, the same man who had burst into their lives like an ominous ghost. He was there, immovable, his shadow stretched across the ground and his eyes glowing with predatory curiosity. "He's here," her voice barely cut through the air. "He's watching us." "How is that possible?" Josh couldn't believe his eyes. "We killed him." "He's not alone," Tom repeated quietly, his voice a clear rhythm, as if he knew something more. "This is their home. They come one at a time, but they don't end. They're waiting for us to be gone." Andy stood up, wobbly, and looked at Tom in horror. "Did you know this all along?" he asked, his voice trembling with tension. "Why didn't you say so?" "No one's listening," Tom replied, his eyes widening in panic. He covered his face with his hands as if trying to hide from the truth. "We're all just part of this game." The knocking on the door repeated, louder, harder. Now it was an insistent sound, as if someone was demanding to be let in. Panic gripped everyone. Josh grabbed the nearest chair and stood in front of the door, ready for the worst. "What do we do?" Meg asked in a shaky voice, her eyes filled with tears. "We won't open it," Josh answered firmly. "The police will be here in a few minutes." But the time dragged on endlessly, the tension growing by the second. There was another knock outside, but this time not on the door. At the windows. Windows in the back, the side, and even up in the attic. They were beginning to realize they were surrounded. Josh turned to the others. "We can't stay here. We have to find a way out." "This is their game," Tom muttered, his eyes glazed with terror. "We've already lost." Josh ignored him, but his confidence began to crumble. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an accident, that they'd been dragged into this trap. The pounding became unbearably loud, as if hundreds of hands were pounding on the walls from all directions. There was a crushing anxiety in the air, and every breath was labored. The lights began to flicker. The electricity seemed to be failing. "We should try to run out the back door," Josh suggested, his voice shaking, but he couldn't just stand there and wait. They all headed towards the back of the house, avoiding the windows, afraid to see anything behind the glass. When Josh swung open the door to the street, they froze. Standing on the threshold was another man, exactly like the one who was in the house and standing at the window. "Is this a joke?" Meg whispered, not believing her eyes. "How could there be two of them?" The man at the threshold slowly raised his hand and pointed at Josh. "You're not getting out of here." His voice sounded as if it were a prediction. "You're already dead. You just haven't realized it yet." They backed up and slammed the door shut, hurriedly propping it open with a chair. Their hearts were pounding furiously, their hands shaking. Meg leaned against the wall, trying to control her panic. "What the hell was that?" Josh whispered, rubbing his temples as if trying to understand what was happening. "How can there be two of them?" "They must be twins," Andy said with difficulty, his voice shaking in terror in his eyes. "It's the only explanation. Maybe it's some kind of sick twin game." "It's the only logical explanation," Meg said, hope in her voice. "Twins. One broke into the house and the other outside." They were tensely silent, thinking it over. Suddenly in the silence came the sound of a siren slowly approaching their house. A police siren. The sounds came closer and closer, and it was like a breath of air for the whole company. "Police," Josh exhaled, and a faint smile flashed across his face. "We're saved." Andy leaned against the wall in relief, his body relaxing as if a stone had been lifted from his soul. "We did it," Meg said, a smile flashing across her face. "They'll get them. Twins or not, they're finished." Everyone looked around, feeling real hope for the first time in a long time. The sounds of the siren grew louder, and soon it was clear that the car had stopped right in front of their house. They heard the slamming of doors, and footsteps approaching the entrance. There was a knock on the door. "It's the police." "Open up," came a confident voice from outside. Josh rushed to the door, removed his chair, and slowly opened it. Two uniformed police officers stood at the threshold with frowning faces. "Are you all right?" one of them asked, looking around the room. "We got a report of screams and a suspicious person." Josh nodded, not hiding his excitement. "There are. Two maniacs, they're twins. One of them is inside," he said, pointing to the motionless body on the floor. The other one was outside. The policemen looked at the body, then looked at each other. One of them crouched down, checking the pulse of the man lying on the floor, then stood up. "This one's dead," he said calmly. "Where's the other one?" "He was standing behind the house." "We don't know where he's gone," Andy answered, staring tensely into the policeman's face. The policeman nodded to his partner, and he moved outside to check the area. "We'll find him. Don't worry," the policeman said in a soothing tone. "But still, are you sure you saw two people?" Meg wrung her hands nervously, but nodded. "Yes, they were the same. I thought I was hallucinating, but they were definitely twins." The policeman looked at her, then scrutinized the whole company. His gaze lingered on Tom, who sat quietly in the corner, still absorbed in his own thoughts. "Too much stress," the policeman muttered. "Our minds can play tricks on us in these situations." Before anyone could answer, the second policeman returned. He looked puzzled. "No sign of the second man," he reported. "The area is clear." Meg, Josh, and the others looked at each other. Their insides went cold. "That's impossible," Josh whispered. "We all saw him." The cops exchanged glances, as if discussing among themselves what to do. "The second maniac probably just ran away when he heard the sirens," one of them said calmly. "We'll put patrols in the area and investigate. For now, you'd better stay safe and try to calm down." "Go to your friends," the other said, before they both headed for the exit. "If we find anything, we'll be in touch." They closed the door behind them, leaving the company alone with silence. "We did see him. We couldn't all be wrong," Meg whispered, looking at the others. But even with that realization, relief slowly began to fill the room. They all settled silently to the floor, exhausted, devastated. They had survived, even if logic told them that there were still many questions ahead. The twins, the maniacs, the strange events, it all seemed like a nightmare they had just gotten out of. "The important thing is that we're alive," Josh said, pulling Meg close to him. And now they would catch him. They could only hope. But even when everything was quiet, There was still something unsettling in the air, as if an ominous shadow was still lingering around them. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled among the neatly trimmed hedges and pristine lawns, lived Mark and Eliza Turner. Their lives had been haunted by a darkness they could never quite escape: the disappearance of their son, Jason, nearly 6 years ago. The day he vanished was seared into their memories: a sunny afternoon, a brief moment of inattention, and then nothing but silence where his laughter once echoed. After a long and fruitless search, they had reluctantly accepted that Jason was gone, their hopes fading into the distance. The world continued spinning around them, but for Mark and Eliza, time had become a cruel parody of life, an endless cycle of grief. They filled the void with routine. Mark returned to his job as a mechanic, while Eliza volunteered at the local library, trying to drown her sorrow in the pages of books. It was a fragile truce with the past, one that crumbled one fateful evening when their phones buzzed in unison. Eliza, perched on the edge of their worn couch, glanced at her phone, her heart racing. A text message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Mom, I'm scared. Please come find me." Panic coursed through her veins, and she rushed to show Mark. He read the message, his brow furrowing in disbelief. "This can't be real," he muttered, a strange mix of hope and dread swirling within him. "Jason." The couple exchanged frantic glances, uncertainty clawing at their insides. The last thing they had heard about Jason was the hollowed-out absence that filled their lives. And now this. They had buried their son long ago, or at least the idea of him. They tried to convince themselves that it was a cruel prank, a sick joke played by a stranger. Mark replied cautiously, hoping for clarity. "Who is this? Are you okay?" The response was almost immediate. "I don't know where I am. They won't let me leave." Their hearts sank further, plunging into a pit of despair. "What do we do?" Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to contact the police," Mark replied, his mind racing. But they had been down this road before: years of futile investigations and dead ends. The thought of a child still alive, possibly in peril, ignited a spark of determination within them. They hesitated for only a moment before dialing the number, their hands shaking as they relayed the text to the officer on the line. An investigation was opened, and the couple was overwhelmed with questions. Each interrogation peeled back layers of their sorrow, revealing the raw pain beneath. Yet the investigation provided little comfort. They were left waiting, hearts heavy with a mix of hope and dread. Days turned into a week, and then another, the anticipation gnawing at their sanity. Then, on the morning of the second week, the messages began to escalate. "Mom, they're coming. I can hear them. Please help me." Each message was a jagged shard of glass, cutting deeper into their souls. Their lives became consumed by these texts, each ping sending a shock wave of fear through them. One evening, while scrolling through the messages, Eliza's gaze fell on a timestamp. "Mark these texts. They're coming from a location," she said, her voice quivering with urgency. Mark leaned closer, squinting at the screen. "Are you sure?" Eliza nodded, heart racing. "Look, there's a GPS link embedded in the message. It's near the old warehouse district." Mark's eyes widened. The district had long been abandoned, a graveyard of forgotten structures and decaying dreams. "We have to go there," he urged, adrenaline coursing through him. Without a second thought, they hopped into their car, racing toward the shadows of their past. As they drove, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. The air grew thick with tension, each passing moment heightened by the fear of what they might discover. When they arrived, the warehouse loomed before them, a monstrous silhouette against the evening sky. They parked a distance away, hearts pounding in their chests as they approached the rusted metal door. The world felt unnaturally quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for them to step into the darkness. Mark pushed the door open, the creak echoing like a death knell. Inside, the smell of mold and decay filled the air. Eliza gripped Mark's hand, squeezing tightly as they moved cautiously through the cavernous space. Dim light filtered through broken windows, illuminating fragments of a world long forgotten. Suddenly, Mark's phone buzzed again. They froze, dread pooling in their stomachs. "I see you." Mark's blood ran cold. "This is wrong, Eliza. We shouldn't be here." But it was too late. They had come this far. "What if it really is him?" Eliza whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. Mark glanced at the phone, heart racing. "We need to find him," he insisted, voice firm. "For him, for us." As they ventured deeper into the warehouse, the atmosphere grew oppressive. Shadows danced on the walls, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. The silence was unnerving, punctuated only by the sound of their footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. Then a noise pierced the stillness, a soft whimper, a child's voice echoing through the corridors. "Mom? Dad?" Eliza gasped, heart soaring. "Jason." They rushed toward the sound, adrenaline fueling their every step. The voice led them to a dimly lit room, the walls covered in peeling paint. In the corner, a figure huddled, small and frail. "Jason," Eliza cried, rushing forward. But as she reached for him, the boy turned, revealing a face that sent a chill down her spine. His eyes were vacant, sunken deep into his skull, and his skin was pale as if he had been drained of life. "I've been waiting," the boy said in a voice that sounded far too old for his years. "They won't let me go." Mark stepped back, confusion and horror washing over him. Who are you?" The child smiled, but it was a smile devoid of warmth. "You didn't come for me." "Not really. You stopped looking." "Stop it. You're not Jason," Eliza screamed, tears streaming down her face. The boy's expression shifted, darkening as he stood. "I am what you wanted to forget. I am the ghost of your failure." Suddenly the room filled with an unbearable heat, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Whispers echoed through the air, voices of children lost to time, haunting the corners of the warehouse. "Let's get out of here," Mark shouted, grabbing Eliza's arm, but the door slammed shut, trapping them within the suffocating darkness. "Mom, Dad," the boy's voice changed, warping into a twisted mimicry of Jason's laughter. "You thought you could forget me?" Eliza screamed, clutching her head as memories of Jason's disappearance flooded back, the guilt, the regret, the overwhelming sense of failure. Mark fought against the door, but it wouldn't budge, the weight of despair pressing down on them like a vice. "Let him go," Mark yelled, rage surging through him. The boy stepped closer, eyes glimmering with something sinister. "You didn't save me then. Why would you think you could save me now?" Suddenly the darkness erupted, shadows swirling around them, and Eliza felt herself being pulled into the void. "Jason," she cried, reaching for the boy who was slipping away. In that moment, the warehouse transformed, becoming a maze of their own nightmares, echoes of laughter, whispers of despair, and the hollow sounds of what once was. The walls pulsed with the memories of a lost child, and Eliza realized the truth: Jason had never truly been lost. He had become a part of the darkness, a ghost that thrived on their grief. As the shadows engulfed them, Mark and Eliza held on to each other, the weight of their choices crushing them. They had thought they were searching for their son, but in reality they were confronting the ghosts of their own making. And as they were swallowed by the darkness, they understood too late that some things cannot be found, they can only be remembered and forgotten. In the aftermath, the warehouse stood silent once more, a monument to lost hopes. And somewhere in the shadows, a new message flickered to life on an old, abandoned phone. "I'm still waiting." Jessica always tried to get out of the office before nightfall. Some innate fear of the streets after sundown made her quicken her steps as the evening shadows began to engulf the city. She's 27 and works as a manager for a large marketing company. The office is her second home. She lived that rhythm, and she thought everything was going according to plan. But this day was different. Today a meeting with a client dragged on until late afternoon, and tired and hungry, she finally left the office at 9 p.m. Rain drizzled in small drops, like a veil hiding the nighttime city from prying eyes. Jessica's coat barely coped with the moisture, and she hurried down the sidewalk, phone in hand, ready to call a cab. The city was noisy, but right now that noise seemed somehow distant, blurry to her. She hailed a car through the app, and raising her eyes to the darkening sky, noted that the rain was getting heavier. A few minutes later, a car stopped at the sidewalk, a silver sedan with a bright logo on the door. Jessica glanced at the driver, who nodded briefly, confirming her order. What struck her was that he didn't look like a typical driver, more like a random person behind the wheel. He was wearing a dark tracksuit, hood pulled deeply over his face. Maybe he's just tired, she thought, not really giving it much thought. Sitting down in the back seat, Jessica quickly immersed herself in her phone. The car touched down, and the quiet music from the radio drowned out the sounds of the city. "Rough day?" the driver suddenly spoke, his voice unexpectedly harsh. Jessica took her eyes off the phone and looked at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes flashed in the reflection. Yes, she answered briefly, trying not to make conversation. They drove in silence for a few minutes. But then the driver broke the silence again. You probably work late a lot, don't you? That question alerted her. How could he possibly know that? She hadn't given any clues. It was unlikely that anyone could guess her work schedule from her appearance. Not that often, Jessica replied dryly, trying to get off the phone again, but the driver didn't calm down. His voice became more insistent. I think you live near Central Park, don't you? She froze. He wasn't supposed to know where she lived. Her address was only listed on the application, and Jessica hadn't said a word about her route. Her fingers shook nervously, and she felt fear creeping closer, like a predator in the night. How do you know that? She squeezed out. He didn't answer immediately, but instead hummed briefly, as if enjoying her reaction. We all know a little more about our passengers than you think. His voice was cold, something menacing slipping into it. The car moved through the narrow streets, and Jessica noticed they were taking a wrong turn. Panic was beginning to rise inside her like a fog filling the space. You're going the wrong way, she said sharply, trying to pull herself together. There's traffic ahead, he replied calmly. I know the city better than it looks. She looked at the map on her phone screen. There was no traffic. The route was clear. He's lying. Jessica felt her heart start to beat faster. She tried to think logically. At that moment, the car suddenly stopped. Why did we stop? Her voice got a little higher, shaky. The driver didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned toward her and finally removed his hood, exposing his face. His features were sharp, his eyes were cold, and his smile was empty. You remember me, don't you, Jessica? He asked quietly, as if they were old acquaintances. Inside, everything clenched. No, she didn't know him. But that look, it was too familiar, too frightening. We've met before, he continued, leaning toward her. You were in a cab then too. I even gave you a ride home. But you didn't remember me, did you? Her head was spinning with panic. She really couldn't remember what it was. But something about what he said was terribly believable. Maybe it was one of those short trips she'd forgotten in the flux of days. She clutched the phone, thinking she could call the police at any moment. I'll come out here, she said, feeling her voice treacherously shaking. Here. He looked mockingly at the dark street outside the window. You want to go out in the middle of an empty neighborhood? Are you sure about this? Her gaze darted to the door. The locks were locked. Everything inside screamed to run, but her body refused to move. I'll call the police. She sounded uncertain, but her hands were already on the phone. He laughed, a low, unpleasant laugh. Do you think they'll get here in time? You don't even know where we are, do you? He was right. Jessica had no idea where they were. The streets had become unfamiliar. It was cold inside the car, the air thick as if space was shrinking around her. What do you want? She finally asked, feeling her heart pounding somewhere in her throat. The driver slowly reached for the glove compartment. Jessica noticed this and grabbed her phone, quickly dialing 911. She didn't know what to say, but only whispered in a surrendered whisper. Help, I've been kidnapped. The driver pulled something out of the glove compartment, a small knife. The blade glinted in the dim light of the street lamps. Are you always such a coward, Jessica? His voice became icy, almost mocking. She knew she had to act. She kicked at the door, trying to break free, but the locks held her tight. The phone fell out of her hands and landed on the floor of the car. At that moment, the headlights of another car illuminated the sedan. The driver cast a brief glance at the lights and abruptly went back behind the wheel. I guess we'll continue this later, he said with menace in his voice, and turned on the ignition. The car moved off, but now Jessica couldn't let him get away. She leaned forward and slapped the steering wheel, trying to get the attention of a passing car. The car next to her slowed down. The driver looked at her with fury. Calm down, or else. But he didn't have time to finish. Jessica grabbed the steering wheel with both hands and turned it sharply to the side. The car went off to the side of the road and hit a tree. The impact was powerful, but not fatal. She felt the full force throw her forward before she came to a stop. The driver was disoriented, his hands loose on the steering wheel. Jessica took advantage of this and ran out of the car, stumbling and screaming for help.